Hi, it's Mike Morse. Welcome to another episode of Open Mic. I'm really glad you're here. We have a really interesting episode today, and I'm going to read the bio. I usually make up the bio as I go along without notes, but this is a little bit outside of the genre we usually do, but I think it's fascinating, and I'm really excited that this guest is with us. As you know, on the morning of September 11th, my birthday, 2001, 19 years ago, 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial passenger jet airliners, intentionally crashing 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York City. The hijackers crashed a 3rd airliner into the Pentagon, and the 4th plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. 3,000 victims and 19 hijackers died. 2 of those planes during those attacks, used in those attacks, the 2 specific ones that hit the World Trade Center, both of those planes took off from Boston's Logan International Airport. I didn't actually remember that, and if you asked me that, I don't know if I would have known. The person in charge of Boston's Logan International Airport on that fateful day was Virginia Buckingham. She joins us to tell us about that day and about the aftermath and about an amazing book and articles she has written. So I'm really excited to welcome Virginia Buckingham to the show.
You never know who you're going to see.
Be one guy one-on-one my whole career.
What you're going to hear.
Got a lot of desperate people in the city.
Or what they've got to say.
When you can take people inside of a crime.
That's what you're going to hear on my podcast, Open Mic. Find it where you find your podcasts.
Thank you. Really good to be here, Mike.
Thanks for taking some time out and being with us today. It's really interesting. I think that 9/11 is one of those things that, I hear the older generations talk about, where were you when you found out about JFK dying? This is it for my lifetime, or, where were you when the OJ verdict came out? But 9/11 is way more important, and I think everybody remembers where they were on that day. I was in London, England, celebrating my birthday. Tell me where you were, Miss Buckingham.
I was getting my 2-year-old son off to daycare before driving into the airport to fly to Washington, D.C. I had a big meeting that day, kind of a crucial meeting with the FAA about a new runway project that we were fighting for at Logan. And it was a normal day, like every other morning, until it wasn't. And I think that's one of the things that we all share, is that sense of our whole world being turned upside down in a second. And I was in the car listening to the news on the radio, as I always did, and heard the report about the first plane, thought it was an accident, just like most people did at the time, and then was listening as the second plane flew in live and was reported from New York. And very shortly thereafter, I got a call from my office at Logan saying 6 words, which changed the world forever, and certainly changed me forever. 2 planes are off the radar.
Wow, I have chills reliving this story with you. When did you realize for the first time that 2 of those planes, when they said those 6 words to you that a layperson like me doesn't fully understand, did you know that 2 planes that left Boston Logan were down or crashed? Or
we didn't know for sure for several hours. It was a very confusing morning with air traffic control all over the country, pulling planes down, getting them down to the ground safely. We were trying to track every plane that had left Logan that morning, and we were given many conflicting reports from the FAA tower. And ultimately, though, we did learn about United 175 and American Flight 11. We had folks that worked with us at Logan who are very close with the American Airlines and United Airlines ground staff, and they told us what they had learned, in some cases from flight attendants calling in from those planes to tell them what was happening.
So try to take us through the chaos of that day. And I assume you never made it to Washington, D.C., but, try to take us through that day.
We raced into the airport from my home on the North Shore. And when I got there, I walked into my office and the TV was on. And I saw for the first time what I had heard on the radio. And there's nothing like seeing it. I know we all see it in our minds, those that remember that day or were alive that day. So I watched the planes. I started making calls. We opened an emergency operations center where we could coordinate the response across different public safety agencies. We opened a family assistance center, so families who feared that their loved ones were on one of the planes could come to the airport if they wanted to and receive information to the extent we had it, support from clergy and the American Red Cross and others. And it was, really a tsunami of decision making. We had to close down the airport, secure all the planes that were on the ground so that they could be part of the investigation. We had to clear thousands of passengers out of the terminals. And it was an intense but focused response. These folks that I had the privilege to lead at Logan were public safety and response professionals. And while we weren't prepared for anything like this, they performed magnificently.
What was your title at Boston Logan?
So I was CEO of the Massachusetts Port Authority, which runs the airport along with other smaller airports in the Port of Boston.
So it's not, it's okay. It's the airport authority. I know there's a lot of shipping there. Were you also in charge of the shipping?
Yes.
Wow. So it's a massive job.
It was a massive job. I had served as chief of staff to two successive Massachusetts governors, and one of them asked me to go over and lead the airport authority when that position became open, because it was the major kind of economic engine of the New England area, and securing things like that new runway that would help alleviate delays that were hampering New England's economy, securing direct shipping from China to the Port of Boston. Those were among the things that I was working on when this happened.
And at some point in time after 9/11 happened, there was some blame coming to the top. Like, how did you let these hijackers, I think there was 10 hijackers that came through Boston Logan that day. Is that right?
Yes, two of them flew in from Portland, Maine into Logan, but ultimately all boarded those two planes at Logan.
So 10 men got through your security. Did they have weapons on them?
So, the 9/11 Commission looked exhaustively at how this could have happened, but you're correct. Very quickly after the attacks, the questions became quite intense about, was it something specific about Logan Airport that allowed this to happen, which made little logical sense given that it had happened at two other major airports at the exact same time with two other airliners. But people were afraid and they were angry. And I became an easy answer to a very complicated question. I was a political appointee at the head of the authority. I was, younger, a woman, all of those factors. And mostly I just think it was people looking for an easy answer and politicians looking for an easy answer. The checkpoints themselves at that time, you might remember, were overseen by the airlines and security companies under the aegis of the FAA. The airport operator was not in charge of those, but I don't think that matters either. These hijackers carried small knives through the checkpoints that weren't detected, and some even say if they were detected, they'd be given back to them because they were so small, and those were allowed at the time. And no one contemplated that they were going to take over the airliners themselves and use them as weapons. That was beyond anyone's imagination, horrible imagination.
That's a good point. And listen, I'm 53. I was way alive when that happened. And of course, I remember time before TSA, but I don't, I haven't really dissected this, that the airlines were in charge and they did hire private security to let people through. You're saying that they had small knives that may or may not have been detected. If they were detected, maybe would have been given back to them. Was there anything that ever came out of it that they're anything wrong with their passports, or that any of that should have been detected before we get into the other stuff? I just don't remember.
I mean, if you go through the 9/11 Commission report, which came out 3 years later, there are all sorts of signs, perhaps, that would have, in hindsight, and it's always that hindsight that's perfect at some level of the CIA or the FBI or at some higher level, maybe put together. But that's again applying perfect hindsight, and it just was not anything that the system was set up to stop. The system, the aviation security system, was set up to deter bombs from being brought onto an airliner, not small knives.
And nobody contemplated before 2001 that anybody would ever try to use massive airliner as a weapon.
No. And, it was 2 days before the first story appeared in the local Boston newspaper that I might be fired as a result. And from there, it became a feeding frenzy, really, of questions and, radio talk show hosts and TV cameras showing up at my front door, and front page headlines and columns and editorials calling into question whether, my position there was the reason this happened. And it became very clear to me when the governor at the time took me aside and said, I know you couldn't have done anything to stop this. I know there's nothing that would have changed what happened, but you know how politics works, and that allows me to sleep at night. And it was a pretty, raw and cynical way of looking at things. I worked in politics for many years, and I hope and believe that the governors I worked for would have risen to the occasion and seen this for what it was. Anyway, I was forced to resign after a public poll that said, almost 40% of the public thought I should be fired.
How many days later was that?
I was forced to resign 6 weeks later. So for those 6 weeks, we stayed focused, and I did my best, as I think leaders try to do, to stay focused on the job in front of me, and bring in an Israeli security consultant to help us go beyond what the FAA was requiring for new security, which we didn't think was adequate, and could cooperate with the investigation and do our best to restore confidence in aviation. My book covers that. So for those interested in those early days in the aviation world, On My Watch is an interesting read from that perspective. But more so, On My Watch is about rebuilding a broken life, because I was very shattered, not just from being fired from a job in public service that I loved, but shortly after that, I was sued personally for wrongful death. And there were only 2 people in the country sued personally, no airline CEOs, no one else was actually held to account like that. And that really shattered my heart and soul.
And we're going to get into all of that. Your book, you wrote a memoir called On My Watch that came out April 2020, chronicling the events of 9/11, your journey through those 6 weeks in the early days, and how the last 19 years have turned out. And so people can buy that on Amazon, I assume. And if there's any bookstores still around, they could probably go in there and find it there too.
Yes, they can order it through any of their local booksellers or find it on Amazon.
So just going back, a little bit. So, you're forced to resign 6 weeks later, and 3 years later, the commission comes out saying what about the security at Boston and the security at the other 2 airports? What were the other 2 airports?
Dulles and Newark.
Dulles and Newark. All right. So what did the commission say about security?
I testified before their investigators under oath, and shared with them what I could about before 9/11 and my thoughts for moving forward. And I asked them, and I just said, if you find that Logan's security was no different than any other airport, please say so, not just for me, but for all of the men and women who work at Logan Airport and have carried this burden on their shoulders. And they did. So when they came out, they had thousands of footnotes. And the very first footnote to that lengthy report said just that Logan's security at the only point that mattered, which was the checkpoints, was no different than any other airports. What's interesting about that, though, is I thought that would be such a huge relief. I thought it would lift the burden from my heart and soul, and it didn't, because I carried inside me all of those voices that said it was my fault, all of those journalists who I respected and had worked with for so many years, all those political leaders. I believed them more than I believed in myself. And that's part of my story in my book as well, is how I had to come to my own conclusion inside that it wasn't my fault and no external source, however official, was going to matter.
Yeah, well, I think we're learning in these days right now that you can't really put much stock into politics and politicians these days and their word. And I mean, I don't want to get into any of that right now, but I hear what you're saying. It's internal, and you weren't looking for external relief. I mean, you were, but it didn't help.
I was looking for it, but it never was going to help me. I looked for it for years. I wanted to be exonerated by the president of the United States. I wanted a governor to say it wasn't my fault. I wanted the front page of the paper to say it wasn't my fault. And I thought that would help. And even if any of those things happened, it wouldn't have.
And fast forward 19 years, how do you feel today?
Content and peaceful, grateful. My book is finding its way to people who are responding to it and getting help from it, which is kind of all it can be. Is if something bad happens, if you can do something good with it, that's a real gift. And people are getting strength from my story, and that gives me a lot of peace.
I'm going to pull up a great Harvard Business Review article you wrote, which talks about which is kind of a precursor to the book, which makes me want to buy your book, which I plan on doing when we get off this podcast. And it talks about your history, and you come down to, you talk about setbacks, and you talk about, it's encouraging for people who have setbacks that they think they can't overcome. And just to share a quick bit of personal history, in 1995, almost to the day of 9/11, on 9/21, was fired from my first job as a lawyer. And I, too, thought that I didn't know how to overcome it. And I didn't know what was going to happen, and I didn't know what possibilities. And I wanted to be exonerated because I knew I didn't do anything wrong. And you talk about, taking your time. You have 4 points here. Take your time. Don't rush into something. Take a chance, which I thought was very smart as well, because you can't just, if something bad happens, you just can't go back to doing the same old thing, right? Redefine resilience, and pass it on. And, sharing the wisdom that you've learned, which is what you're doing in your book. I wrote a book, Fireproof, that my listeners know about, kind of doing the same thing. We should probably swap books, you and me.
Yeah, I will.
I'll send you a copy,
okay.
And we'll exchange addresses when we get off this. And so I hear where you're coming from, and I'm glad that 19 years later you're doing well. And I want to get back to some of the details, what you've went through, but I also want to spend a few minutes reminding people. And, quite frankly, I didn't read the 9/11 Commission report. I don't know many people who did. I lived it. I don't think about it as much as I should. I have visited the 9/11 Memorial, which is pretty powerful. I'm sure you have. And so let's just go through some of the facts, just to lay out what happened that day for some of our younger listeners and viewers who weren't there, and then we'll get more into the book. Okay?
Sounds good.
Okay. So back then, before TSA, when did the hijackers who came through Logan, when did they buy those tickets? And what method did they use to buy them?
I don't know the method that they used, but the 9/11 Commission report, which you referenced, kind of lays out the timeline. And it was sometime in late summer that they bought the actual tickets. And actually, I start the book with kind of a TikTok of what I was working on and doing versus what the 9/11 Commission report shows the hijackers doing. And it's kind of eerie because, obviously I was going about my business and working on the priorities and raising, I had, as I mentioned, a 2-year-old son. I was 5 weeks pregnant on 9/11 with my daughter, and hadn't told anyone yet except my husband. And so I kind of contrast that airiness and how they were taking cross-country flights. And there were records that we found later of their taking a car in and out of our garage at Logan. So clearly they were, surveilling the place. Obviously no one knew that in advance. So all the plans that they were making as we were innocently going about our lives.
And were any of them on any watch lists at that time?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that 2 of them were on one of the airline's frequent flyer lists who could go to the club before boarding the airline. So that's how natural and normal they made themselves as part of our society, which is really eerie. I came in contact with this gate agent at Portland, where 2 of the hijackers, for whatever their reasons were, boarded a plane that morning to Logan from Portland, Maine. And, I don't know how he's doing now. I hope well, but he really struggled and suffered because he let them board, but he had this gut sense there was something wrong with them because of how evil and angry they appeared, but he couldn't do anything about it. What could you do? Stop a businessman from traveling because of your gut instinct? That was never going to happen. And
that's giving me chills. That's giving me weird chills.
It's that normalcy at the time that is just hard to wrap your arms around. And actually, I contacted that gate agent. His name is Michael Toohey. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. And we talked for over an hour because we both shared that same heartbreak of if only we had known something or been able to do something. And, I know it haunted him for many years. It haunted me for many years.
Are we safer now than we were on September 11th, 2001 flying?
Yes. I mean, I have been out of the aviation industry for 19 years, so I'm not going to profess that I am an expert at what is happening now. But absolutely, it hasn't happened again for many, many reasons, including the changes of security. I walk through the security checkpoints now when I travel a lot for work, and I say thank you to the TSA agents. I know a lot of people are irritated with the wait and the inconvenience, but I say thank you because they are there to keep us safe, and they remember every single day why they're there. The cockpit doors, they're not open anymore. They're shut, and they won't open for anything. And I think that's a big, big step forward. Obviously, people can disagree about our foreign interventions, but disrupting terrorists where they live before they get organized and come here has clearly made a difference. So yes, we're safer.
So, wow, the fact that you talked to that gate agent is reverberating through my body, and the fact that he had a gut about that is, and you're right. I mean, he would have been profiling had he said,
"That's right.
You guys don't feel right to me."
Thing. Yeah, before that was even a thing we talked about, he would have been in big trouble had he tried to stop them.
Well, hey, yeah, you could have put him in a room. You could have stripped him naked. All they had on them was a couple of knives. What was in their brain? Attacking a cockpit, taking over the flying of a plane. I don't remember ever. I mean, you were in charge of a massive set of airports and ports. You never saw a memo or somebody even suggest this may happen. This is a something that we're worried about. I mean, nobody thought about it. It was basically, and I hate to use the word genius on their behalf because that almost sounds like I'm admiring them. I'm not, but they were smart.
They were evilly smart.
Evilly smart. Thank you. Evilly smart.
So I had a memo sent to me. It's interesting you bring that up in April of that year which talked about, in general, terrorist threats against airports from my security director. Nothing actionable, nothing to do with. We were in the middle of a security audit, actually, top to bottom, of Logan Airport. But that memo haunted me too, because I, would have done something had it been actionable, obviously. But the papers reported on it afterwards as yet another example of something that had been overlooked at Logan. And I don't know if you remember this, but there was a lot of reports that the President of the United States, President Bush, had received a memo titled "Al Qaeda Poised to Attack in the United States" in August of that year. And again, people said, "Oh, that should have told him everything he needed to know." And it didn't tell him anything, because it wasn't about this. It wasn't about flying airliners into buildings. And people want to hold on to those reasons why it could have been stopped, because that means it can't happen again. And it's a really flawed way of thinking. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but I talk a lot about the destructiveness of blame in our culture, and why it is not leadership, and why it doesn't solve anything.
Interesting. So people here help on the podcast write some questions. And, in your opinion, and I think you just answered it, but could anything have been done? In hindsight, even, like, you can't profile. I mean, you still can't really profile. I'm sure there's ways around it, but I mean, after thinking about it for 19 years, reading the commission report, I mean, do you think anything could have been done to stop the 9/11 attacks?
No, I don't. I really, truly don't, by anyone. And I know people try to now blame the CIA and the FBI and all the other agencies, but no one's omniscient. So the people that had them in flight school and were concerned about them weren't talking to the people over here that saw them flying on the planes cross country a few times and wondered, all those little pieces. No one's omniscient, and no one could have put those together ahead of time.
So I completely forgot that these guys took American flight lessons.
They did.
And has that is that regulated now? Who can get flight lessons, and they're all being vetted before they can take a plane out?
I actually don't know. I don't know the answer.
I don't know that either. And I have friends who are pilots, and I've never asked that, but that's interesting, because we see small planes flying all the time, right? I mean, are somebody watching who's flying? So let's talk about your book, On My Watch. I mean, was it hard to relive all of this, or was it more of a cathartic process?
So I lived it every day, and still do in many ways. So it was helpful to put words to the experience, first for my own processing of what happened and what it was, and then ultimately to try to understand what it might offer to readers. As an author yourself, you don't write a book for yourself, even if it helps you in some way heal. You write it for readers. You write it for others. So yes, it helped me process, and that it's helping others now is incredibly healing.
And I want people to go out and buy this book, and they will, but what's the core message that you're trying to get across in your book?
Well, beyond the destructiveness of blame, which we've talked a little bit about, it's really about a different way of thinking about resilience. And I thought I was failing at resilience for many years. I felt I was failing at being strong. And so many people had told me, just get over it, put it behind you, slam the door, move on. And I couldn't. And yeah, I was still building a life of raising my two children. I was building a new career. So it wasn't that I was completely shattered and broken forever. So what's the real answer to what resilience can look like? And how I feel and how I describe it on my watch is it's more like a piece of sea glass. That's the metaphor I ultimately use, because it comes from a bottle that is broken apart over many years in the sand and the salt and the waves, and becomes something completely different than what it started as, yet still of value. Broken, changed forever, still capable of bringing meaning and joy to others. And that's how I think of resilience, that you carry your brokenness and your joy with you side by side to build a new life.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So what lessons, you say that we can learn about how to better deal with COVID, with some of the lessons that you've learned in this, looking back at 9/11. And I don't really understand what you mean by that.
Okay. So I do see some similarities, certainly, in people casting blame as often as they can at the superintendent of their school or their mayor or their governor or the president or anyone for not handling this perfectly. And if things had been done differently sooner, et cetera, things wouldn't be so bad. I just feel that's a real flawed way of thinking about things. But more so, just like on 9/11, our world was turned upside down come February and March in this country. And I think that what I learned and what helped me thrive and move forward was the compassion and empathy of other people. And I think that that's really the key in overcoming the changes in our lives for COVID. Is we all, that saying I've read, which I agree with, we're all in the same storm, but a different boat. We all are going through something hard now, at whatever level. It could be you've lost a loved one, God forbid. It could be you've lost your job. It could be you're just afraid and anxious, depressed. But we all are going through something, and showing compassion and empathy to each other, helping each other, I think is the only silver lining, perhaps, that will come of this.
That's a great message. Great message. I couldn't agree with you more. You're an inspiration for anyone trying to fight back from adversity. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience?
Yes, maybe more for your women listeners. As a mom of an 18-year-old daughter who's grown up in this era of change and transformation and fear, be your own hero. Don't wait for someone else to save you. Stand up and save yourself, and offer whatever you can, whatever wisdom you might glean from your experiences to others.
I have an 18-year-old daughter, and I've heard her say, I am my own hero. That is really interesting that you said that. 18-year-olds are fantastic, aren't they?
Oh, most of the time.
Most of the time. Well, we'll talk offline about that, but thank you so much for being with us today. On My Watch, available wherever you can find books these days. Ours are being sold mostly on Amazon. But thank you so much, Virginia Buckingham, for being with us. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
And thanks for writing it.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
You too. Well, thank you for watching Open Mic with Virginia Buckingham, the person in charge of Logan International Airport on 9/11 in 2001, 19 years ago. Just reliving it with her, I'm telling you, I got chills. I got sad. I was welling up with tears and feelings just reliving 9/11. The fact that she was in charge on that day where two of her planes went into the towers in the World Trade Center. I'm a little off because of that interview. I'm not going to lie. I think her message is great. I look forward to reading her book On My Watch. If you think anybody would benefit from hearing or listening to this episode or watching this episode, please forward it, share with somebody, like it, comment, and please subscribe to our channels. And thanks for watching and listening to Open Mic.